Hi everyone, we're just letting everybody join, and then we will start very shortly. Can I just check in the chat that you can all see the slides there? If you can just put yes in the chat, that would be great. Brilliant. Thank you. Okay. So, thank you, everybody. And thank you for joining us today for the first in our Inspired Global Network series for quite a while. So, I would like to say thank you to Dame Jackie Daniel for joining us today and being our keynote speaker. We are so delighted that she's going to be delivering the first of hopefully many, many more of these sessions. Jackie began her NHS professional career as a nurse before moving into NHS management. Following a decade at board level, she then became a CEO for 22 years and most recently CEO at Newcastle Hospitals, one of the largest hospitals in the UK. Not afraid to take on a challenge, Jackie has led several complex turnarounds, including financial, quality, and cultural issues. She has a track record of transformation and bringing innovative and enterprising solutions to solve complex problems. Um, in 2017, Jackie was recognised in the Queen's New Year's Honours List and awarded DBE for her services to the NHS. And Jackie fulfills a new strategic advisory role and is a global luminary with Accenture, as well as one of our leaders in residence here at Lancaster University Management School. So we're delighted to have her with us today. And over to you, Jackie.
Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for joining. So what I'm really hoping to do in this next session is share with you some of my experience from all of those years of leading in the NHS, share some insights, particularly about how to create hope and inspiration in that context of constant change and uncertainty. I think that's writ large in terms of the world we're living in at the moment. And when I was asked to speak, it didn't really take me long to land on that subject because, well, having spent a career leading in the NHS, I'm struck by just how tricky it is to lead in these times of really fast-moving change and often really difficult change. So I really hope that by sharing some of my experience and the approaches that I've used, what I'm able to do is arm you people, whatever leadership role you're in at the moment, with a few more tools in your toolkit. And I'm hoping that we can explore in more detail some areas that I found helpful, and we might get into some questions once I've finished speaking. The approaches that I'm going to talk to you about are drawn really from a whole lot of reading and learning in terms of occupational behavioral psychology, lots of organizational development and management and leadership theory. And rather than cite lots of references, um, and all of what I'm going to talk to you about is based on lots of theory, but instead I'm going to try and give you some really pragmatic and practical examples. So if you could move on to the next slide. So I feel really fortunate, as has been touched on there in the introduction. I've spent 42 years working in the NHS, and honestly, I've loved every minute of it. I can really say that hand on heart. I joined all those years ago when I trained as a nurse, and kind of quickly understood that I was on a mission to improve care, to improve experience, and above all, improve outcome for patients. So I worked clinically for 10 years, and I was a ward sister running a busy surgical ward, overseeing the care of 30 patients. And what a privilege that leadership position was. knowing the care on that ward was as good as it could be. Patients and families were feeling involved in and informed about their care, and the team of staff were feeling really well supported and valued. But as my mission continued, I kind of realised that those conditions weren't uniform, and that the care received by patients on the surgical ward opposite me might be significantly different and not in a positive way. And I think at that point, I really began to appreciate the value and worth of really good leadership. So at that point, I took a step out of the clinical environment and went into general management, where I was then overseeing a bigger group of wards and departments. And I learned lots and lots, particularly about managing large budgets and working with really different groups of staff. But during that time, I began to understand and take an interest in decision making, and got curious about, well, where do these decisions really get made? And I began to see what was happening in the boardroom with the executive team and the more senior leaders. So it was no coincidence then at 29, I applied for my first director's role, which was a director of nursing at a large first wave foundation trust in the NHS. And I was responsible for nursing and midwifery standards, professional leadership for that workforce. And of course, for the first time, I began to understand my corporate responsibilities as a board member. And this really, really took me out of my comfort zone, not for the first time, and it's happened many, many times since then, but working with a predominantly male and older team, comparatively, I slowly learned to navigate politics, issues around being a woman in very senior roles, and how to lead significant change. And what I would say to all of you on this call is it's fine to feel out of your comfort zone. It's actually giving you an awful lot. It does feel uncomfortable, but you're probably learning more at those times than at any other times. So after 10 years in that role, I knew I wanted to be a chief executive. And so at 39, I began a 22-year tenure leading NHS organisations. And I've held 5 CEO roles in total, all completely different across specialised acute mental health and social care. And my last role, as has been said, was at Newcastle Hospitals, serving the northeast of England. It was a real honour to be recognised as a dame. You never know where those recommendations come from. You just never do. But I think it came from the work that I did when I was chief executive at Morecambe Bay. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that shortly. Now, last December, I decided I was going to step back. I didn't want to do another full-time CEO role in the NHS, but I knew that I wanted to contribute and continue to make a difference. So, yeah, I'm now a healthcare advisor. I really enjoy being a global luminary for Accenture. I support a couple of healthcare startups, and I'm a trustee on a few boards, but probably more notably with the NHS Confederation. And I'm really, really proud to say that since being made a dame, I mean, what do you do with it when you're made a dame? It's a funny thing. Anyway, I'm with a couple of other people. I founded the Dames Commander Society, which we launched in the House of Lords this year. And what we're trying to do there is bring the energy and the voice of the about 600 living dames in the UK together to do what we hope are going to be really great things. So please look out for that. Next slide, please. So leadership and leading are really not for the faint-hearted. It's always been tough, and it always will be. And it's not just in the NHS. I know that we've got people on the call from all kinds of sectors. And I think fundamentally leadership is about a quest for improvement. However small, leaders like me, leaders like you, are on a mission to make a difference by the words and their actions and the things that you do every day. So you will recognise some of these force fields of change that are on the slide here. I think they're relevant to whatever sector you're leading in. And I just want to shout out two that I'm noticing, particularly in health at the moment. The role of technology and innovation, it is central. I think it's probably central in whatever sector, and it's the reason that I joined Accenture, because it's an area I'm particularly interested in. But when you think about, the use of telemedicine and remote consultations, now we really began to do that really well during COVID because, frankly, we didn't have any other option. But now seeing the way that AI and machine learning are being applied to diagnostics and cancer treatment, the way that data analysis is leading to really, really sophisticated population health management models in health. And, technology which is transforming operational efficiency. So there's no wonder really that the current health secretary has made analog to digital one of the three major shifts that he's championing in the NHS right now. Excuse me. And the demographic shifts, it's worth saying something about that. These are happening, really huge shift in the UK. And by 2040, we know that at least 1 in 4 people in our population will be over 65 years of age. And that shift's really significant for so many things. But in the NHS, it brings with it age-related disease such as dementia and cardiovascular disease in a much larger scale. And we're also seeing the growing prevalence of chronic disease and chronic illness like diabetes, but also illnesses like, areas like obesity, which is causing really huge strain on an already pressured NHS. So the point here is we're surrounded by those force fields of change, and it's useful, whatever role you're in, to just take a look up and out at which ones are applicable to the areas where you're leading. But I want to make one point just before we go any further in the presentation about people, because change revolves around how individuals and groups adapt to new conditions, how they deal with those force fields of change. People drive change, people resist change, and ultimately shape its success or failure. So when I think, it's rare that I feel I can really control those forces of change. But what we can do, and what's in your gift and my gift, is to make better choices when we're leading through change. And those choices make a really big difference to the way that people feel, the way that people respond to that change. So next slide, please. So those force fields of change probably wouldn't be recognised in truth at the front line, and that weren't recognised in some of the organisations I was leading. But what staff day to day would see, for example, is the consequence of having insufficient budget due to the tight economic scenario. In healthcare, what they would definitely see today is more and more people coming through the accident and emergency department being seen by community teams. They would see the consequence of an ageing and sicker population. And they would probably recognise, certainly, the frazzled, understaffed workforce and the demoralisation of hospital teams who were struggling to maintain those levels of patient safety and quality. So, we can, it's about the framing and the language, I think, and about the situation. And I've experienced all of those scenarios. And I'm sure you've heard the phrase situational leadership. It is important in the things we're going to go on to talk about now to just take a moment to reflect. What are the big macro elements that are bringing about the change, but how's that manifesting itself in the place that you're leading? And it will that will have a big effect and a big impact on how you choose to lead the change. So if I can give you just a couple of examples. So financial turnaround, for example, in one CEO role, I took 30 million out in a year, 30 million pounds worth of costs out in a year. And under those circumstances, pace is really important. Deep engagement with staff is probably not as realistic. And my approach was much more directive. I was using much more formal approaches, such as project management, risk management, performance monitoring, etc. When I led Morecambe Bay Hospital, I was faced with deep quality and cultural issues, which had resulted in really poor quality of care and treatment. And that had actually led to the death of at least 11 babies and a mother. And in that leadership role, of course, it was crucial to engage with staff at all levels. It was really important to work with families and communities outside the hospital. And that change programme was extensive. It took a long time to work through bringing the right leadership to play, the skills and putting in the skills and capabilities that were needed, and really building the organisational culture and ways of working so that they were embedded. And that work took me 6 years, and I know that it continues today. And then if we just look at the example of the pandemic, that was a really truly interesting exercise in leadership. I hope we don't need to repeat it. But in Newcastle hospitals, as chief exec, we took the first COVID patient in the UK. And we quickly realised we were going to have to triple the number of intensive care beds. So creating a 200 bed plus regional unit. We knew we were going to have to build a COVID testing lab on the banks of the Tyne for the northern population. And we knew we were going to ask as a regional centre to build a lighthouse hospital in 5 weeks in case the region's hospitals ran out of beds. So the point I'm trying to make is, of course, that context and issues are different and truly situational. But the good news is that there are a set of constant and consistent things leaders can use as their navigation points, if you like, when leading people through change. And just before we move on, I just want to come back to the people point, because why are hope and inspiration important when you're trying to lead that kind of change? Well, put it simply, because they provide the emotional fuel that support individuals and teams. And, you know, I saw that in bucket loads in the pandemic. And we know that hope fosters resilience. It fosters and fuels optimism, and that all important belief that's really, really important, particularly when the path isn't clear. So it wasn't in COVID. We didn't know what was coming next. And we know that inspiration drives action and it maintains morale. It also creates creativity and innovation instead of fight or flight, which is a pretty basic emotional, physiological response to changing circumstances. It's not helpful, that, because people freeze and then they become unable to do what they need to do next. So if you look at it through this lens, I think it helps us as leaders see change not just as a burden and a drag anchor, but as a change, an opportunity for growth, an opportunity for change. So how do you lead in that way? I'm going to give you some of the tools in my toolkit, and I'm going to start by this next slide, which really talks about me and you. You just flip to that next slide. I often felt as a chief exec like I was clearly the chief executive, but I felt like the chief energy officer. And maintaining energy is really difficult at times. And CEOs, like any leader, are human, and so there's a limit, to that. But especially, in difficult times, it's really important that you manage your own energy. And there are things over the years that I've learned, and I'm going to just share a couple with them, and that have increased my capacity to get things done, and definitely meant my energy was kept at a more optimal level. So I can't unpack everything here, but the big point is put your own oxygen mask on first. You can't help those around you without that. I tend to go back to fundamentals at my times of greatest change and stress. And they sound really simple and oversimplistic, but things such as your own health, exercise, diet, sleep, your mental health and well-being. Now, this is going to be different for everybody. A useful thing to just refer back to is where you sit on the spectrum of introversion or extroversion. I'm an introvert. You know, if you're a fan of tools like Myers-Briggs, you'll know what your profile looks like. So I need time. I need time alone. I need time in the open space. I need to reflect. And so learning to put things in place to help me do that is really important. Feeling really overwhelmed is a common symptom for leaders. And one of the things that I've referenced on this slide is I always work in 12-week blocks now. I break that into 2 6-week timescales, 2 6-week chunks, because for me, and I think the evidence is pretty compelling, that 12 weeks is quite it's an optimal time to make change and see progress. It's a long enough time for new routines and habits to start to stick, but working in 12 weeks also allows for regular enough review. And importantly, you can start to take action before you go too far off course. Now, there's a saying that I come back to often, that your habits are the architecture of your life. And so the little things you do every day, and you're on autopilot a lot more of the time than you think. But the way that you use your time, it's probably your biggest and most crucial asset. And I've worked with a lot of leaders who do not have the right level of focus and intent on what they're doing that day, that week, or that month, in order to achieve their objectives. So at the times of greatest change, or the times when I'm under most pressure, honestly, I know every single day what my intentions for that day are. I wake up, I know I do some work the day before. I wake up, I know what they are. It doesn't always mean that I achieve them, but I guess, it certainly increases my chances. So I want to move on to the next slide, where this is a tool I've developed, which has been really instrumental. You can't see all the details. Some of that's blurred. It doesn't matter. I've been using this tool for a decade or more, and it's made a big difference. It's the way I work, it's the way I live my life, and it's made even the most difficult roles manageable. I call it diary swatching. In essence, it involves, if you wanted to have a go at this, I would say I would get about 6 months of your diary, and I would just try and, it's good idea. You can print some of it off. You can just look back, notice the things, the types of meetings, the types of events, and the things that are consuming your time. And then as you're thinking about those, notice the impact on your energy. And quite often when you look at your diary, you'll have quite a visceral, certainly sometimes quite an emotional reaction to a thing in your diary, an event. And that's because that's telling you how it's going to impact on the energy and how you feel about it. And what I do, I found it's possible to split that diary activity into 5-ish groups. It doesn't matter, there might be 6 for you, there might be 4, and colour code them accordingly. And what you start to see on the right-hand side with colour is you start to have an instant relief map of what your working week is going to look like. Now, I'm going to give you some examples here. So my most challenging meetings are the ones that don't actually look red on this diagram, but they're red. because those meetings I know are going to take a heck of a lot of technical and emotional preparation. They're the ones that are likely to leave me absolutely energy depleted. Similarly, the purple ones, these are often my corporate meetings. So there might be my executive team meetings, my board meetings. These are ones I'm often chairing. They need a lot of prep and they're very energy zapping for an introvert like me. And I need time to think. So I began diarising some of that time in, and you can see the week that we're looking at here, it's in green. Not a lot of it, but there's a little bit of it. How much time do you have and put in your diary just to think and reflect on how things are going, how things are working through, what you need to do to prepare. And the yellow colour for me is typically time spent out and about with staff or at staff events, or events like this actually. They're coded yellow because that time energizes me. Now, before I started working in this way, I'd often crash into a Friday and I literally did not know what had happened. I'd hit a wall, and I wondered, I couldn't understand what was it I was doing wrong? And the point is, you can't always change what's coming up in your diary. Sometimes you just can't do that, but you can change what you do before you go into that meeting. You can often change what you do after work on that evening. And I began to build in what I call my restorative niches. A bit of time for me. Sometimes it was a 5-minute walk at lunchtime. Sometimes it was a massage or a run after work. You know what? You do whatever it takes. But if you look at the diary on the left, that's what my diary, and that's what lots of people I coach and mentor now, and it can often look more chaotic than that. That it's just beige, it's overlapping. You couldn't hope to look at that calendar and know what your working week was going to be like. But looking at the colours, when you get familiar with them, on the right hand side, you've got a bit of a hope of managing your time, managing yourself really well, and therefore much more effective leader. Now, this stuff is really, really important. So I'd urge you to have a look at your schedule, and look at how you're using your time. Now, if we go on to the next slide, the next few slides, I'm going to talk you through the means to manage that in an organisation or in a team. And I use this framework, and there are 3 domains in it, as you can see there. The first one is leadership, and that is all important. Have you got leaders that are aligned in their mission? Have you got good leadership behaviours going on? Are you, as the leader or a leader, showing up in terms of the best you? How are you looking after? And I'm a big believer there is a very clear connection between the mind and the body. So if you're doing one and not the other, you're not performing as well as you might. But let's move on to look at the middle part of this diagram, which is the thing I call System 1. And you'll recognise it. It's the operating and governance framework. And I would expect you to be all familiar with this. All organisations have some form of this sort of structure, where it's led by the strategy, it's supported by policies and procedures, it's got things like risk and performance management processes. And in the NHS environment, these are what I would call my board to ward processes. They provide consistency of approach, they allow progress to be measured, and they tell us, most importantly, when things are going wrong. And this is the place where you see your organisational chart. You'd see where you sat. It's quite bureaucratic, it's hierarchical often. And it is really, really important, can I say that? It's where often in any organisations, a lot of the committees spend their time making sure that all the elements of this is working really well. And as a leader, you need to make sure it's tip top all of the time. So it is really, really important, but it's not the whole story. So when I would have early on in my career spent all my time focusing on leadership and System 1, because that's what I felt was the most important. It was as I began to get more experienced and when I was the CEO at Morecambe Bay that I realised it wasn't the whole story. And actually, that System 1 working was only touching a fraction of the organisation. And as I began listening to staff, listening to families, I began to see there were a lot of people who weren't involved, and I began to get really curious about how to encourage staff to work in different ways. And for want of a better title, I've just called this System 2 working. It's a space in which much of, if you think about organisational development type of work in an organisation, it's typically, not done through the formal hierarchy. Some of it is, but not all of it. It's a space where staff can come together to talk about what's important to them. And even in organisations where leaders are not encouraging this kind of work, it's happening because people will find a way to set up discussion groups, talk about what's important to them. The danger is if you don't support it, it gets pushed into the dark corners of your organisation and suppressed. But in actual fact, it's such a positive space where communities of interest can come together in a less formal or hierarchical way to work on the things that really matter to them. So next slide, please. I'll often talk about the kind of art and the science between System 1 and System 2. And it's a little bit of an overstatement, that, but I want you to bear with me because I think just thinking about some of the work that I've seen in System 2, some of the best work I've seen has occurred in that space. When I was at Morecambe Bay, I asked for volunteers to come forward and work with me on the cultural change we needed to bring about. And that group of people they didn't come from the formal system, System 1. They actually came from all corners of the organisation, actually called themselves the Leadership Activist Group, but worked in a much less formal way with me on the cultural change that we needed to see. At Newcastle Hospitals, we were the first trust in the world, sounds rather grand, to declare a climate emergency. Now, that wasn't because we had all the answers, but that was driven by groups of staff who were working in System 2 space, who were really passionate about sustainability agenda. And they started organising themselves around areas of interest. Some of them were clinical teams looking at how to take plastics and that sort of thing out of care pathways. Some people were just really passionate about, how we were transporting goods and stuff around our sites and doing that in a clean way. But, the result was we got a whole drive of some really impressive work that was nationally, internationally recognised to support planetary health. And in COVID, we were working at such a pace in a space that we didn't know enough about. So a lot of the work that really worked in Newcastle was done in System 2 type spaces. And some of the best EDI work I've seen happens in System 2 spaces. And I think that's because it attracts different people. It offers an alternative to the formal bureaucratic and hierarchical models, which can put some staff off, or they might feel they're not part of it. And I think importantly, thinking about people and change, it actually starts to build what I call, it's not my term, but relational fabric. Relational fabric. If you think about that, it goes beyond engagement, which is a bit of an overused term. It really hooks people, it drives people at a deeper level to get engaged in change. Now, come on to the next slide, please. One of the challenges when you're trying to navigate change is how you communicate it. Communication is so important to any any leadership challenge. And, you'll have heard the evidence is that, people can need things repeating anywhere between 2 and 7 times. That's the evidence before they really hear what's being said. So you obviously need to work on different channels. Some people use social media. Some people like just to be in a room and actually hear it. Some people will naturally just, lean in and watch a YouTube about something. The important thing is the messages and the narrative needs to be framed. I'm quite a fan of storytelling, in terms of really helping people understand what's happening. You can imagine how important that was, for example, in Morecambe Bay, and during the pandemic. And I'm just going to just illustrate just how that frame that we've just used could be told, if you like. What would be the narrative about using that framework? So in terms of leadership, for me, it's about developing our leaders to build healthier and stronger teams. In healthcare, the evidence is really strong that well-led, well-supported staff who feel valued deliver massively better outcomes for patients. That is just undisputed. But thinking about the importance of supporting people to be the best selves, supporting them to be healthy in terms of their physical and mental health, and how do you create creativity and innovation instead of fight or flight, which is actually really, really problematic. So in terms of the governance, of formal governance, and the system one work, well, that's important because we all need access to policies, to processes, to systems that enable us to do what we do safely and do the best possible job every day. And then if we think about the system two work, creating those coalitions of networks of activity, well, making the point here that we want to provide the opportunity for our work to be shaped by our teams for the benefit of them and who they're serving, is really, really important. Now, another word on communication, if we can move on to the next slide. And this is about a bit about sense making in really difficult change programs and the value of partnership and collaboration. We've just talked about the importance of clear communication and narratives when you're leading change, but it's really helpful if it's not you as a leader, if you're not the only one talking about it, not the only one promoting it, talking about the benefits of the change, et cetera, et cetera. In the model we've just been through, the staff that are engaged either in system one or system two will, I'm sure, play their part in talking about the change effort and the journey and what's working well and what isn't. But I found what's a really powerful amplifier of all of that is the voice of partners. So this slide references two important collaborations in my career. The first one was Bay Health and Care Partners, and that was whilst we created that whilst I was a chief executive at Morecambe Bay. If you can imagine, at that time, the UK's press and media were continuously over a number of years telling their versions of the story. I and my team were telling ours. But what was really helpful was the collaboration of all of those system players. So I'm talking about GPs, I'm talking about commissioners, the community leaders themselves, local councils, MPs. Those system partners began telling their story of progress from their perspective. That is hugely powerful, as it generally just presents a different way of telling the story from a wholly different perspective. And you know what? It reached a really different audience. Importantly, the communities that we were serving. So really important. And more recently, as CEO at Newcastle, leading through a pandemic, we formed what we called Collaborative Newcastle. That was a collaboration between the City Council, the universities, health and care providers, local businesses. And during COVID, that really, really helped us explain our thinking, the plans we were putting in place, why we were doing it. the population health impact the pandemic was having. It was a really it was a game changer, I think, for me. And if we go on to the next slide, I just want to, as we come into the end of the presentation now, I want to come back. I mean, these images need no explanation, really, and they still make me feel quite emotional. And they're a reminder. I just want to come back to that leading change is all about the people, and that in order to create hope and inspiration during those times, we've got to find the compelling hook which will resonate with people. I hope that I've given you a few ideas so far, and I'm sure we'll get into some Q&A and create some more through discussion. But let's just touch on the next slide if we can, please. So there's really solid evidence that creating hope and inspiration makes change easier, makes it likely to be more successful and sustainable. And looking at some of the words on this slide, I think it is possible to create a much more positive, more productive, more innovative space to occupy. And I hear a really good phrase in the NHS, not just in the NHS actually, at the moment, which is being kind of championed through the improvement, the global improvement work that I'm part of, which talks about how do you create joy at work, even during the most difficult of circumstances. And I guess some of what we've talked about thus far really gets to the essence of what we're talking about here. And the last slide, please. I want to just end with what should be pretty obvious, and I'd really hope that this is a note that we can all reflect on. I spend a lot of time reflecting on this as a leader. I still do. But really thinking about what's your mission as a leader, and why does it matter? And the reason I think this is so important, and there's some pictures here on the slide about me as a leader, a chief exec, and the kinds of things we were doing and why it mattered. But authenticity as a leader is really, really pivotal. People can really see inauthenticity. They can really notice when a leader is coming from a place of authenticity. So you've got to work out, I think it's really important that you work out what your mission is and why it matters, because this alone can catalyze a lot of that hope and inspiration when it counts most. And for the teams that you're working with, if they can see you do that and sometimes have the courage to stand up and push boundaries further than you might, I think it encourages others to follow. So if we end with the last slide, please, I really hope that's given you a kind of flavour of some of the approaches I've used, given you some tools to perhaps put in your own toolkit, and given us some thought for what I hope will be a discussion as part of the Q&A now. But thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. And thank you everybody who has attended today. That was really interesting. We do have some questions already in the chat. So if I can just start posing some of those questions now. If you do have a question, please do post it in the chat area or the Q&A. The Q&A isn't always visible to everybody, so I can switch between the two. So please do post them in the chat. The first question has come through is, what are the decision drivers for change in your opinion?
Well, we talked a bit about, thanks, Damien. We talked a little bit about the, sometimes it can be contextual, right? So it's like, who's making the decision? Often I found as a leader, it was the circumstances which were driving the need for change. Ultimately, there are always decisions to made about which ones you're gonna choose and which ones you're going to prioritize. you've probably got a menu of option in any circumstances. For me in healthcare, of course, I would say this, wouldn't I? But patient safety and quality would always trump a financial driver for change. It just would.
Hmm.
I think this is really where some of the structure in System 1, Damien, where you've got people who are responsible for decision making. I think it's really, really important to get some collective choices made amongst those people who are responsible for the governance and overall decision making of any organisation to be part of that choice, because there will be always quite a lot of things that are driving the decisions you might make about change. And I think it does come back to that: what mission are you on, and what's
Hmm.
most important at the time?
Yeah.
um, which is why it is so kind of circumstantial and situational.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And we've seen at the moment, especially in the last 3 to 4 years, the various different sectors and businesses are implementing change in a number of different ways, and that's affecting staff in different ways. So we can see how various different sectors have had to manage that, whether it's economical impact, what's happening overseas. All of these factors do affect business change, and government obviously being one of the most recent ones. The second question from Damien was around what, in your opinion, do you see the benefits of constant change versus stability?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, Damien. And there's something for me about um, a kind of constant state that you can almost kind of create as a leader in terms of the organizational. I think this is really where organizational culture comes about. It's like that for me can be the one thing that you can create a kind of constant state in. And it's really, really important that there is a bit of a constant state, that a more familiar way of working, because it is possible to create an organization that values compassion and kindness, for example. Even in the periods where there's like change happening, and really fast-paced change. I gave you some examples of, that financial turnaround that I had to do. It was probably my least loved job. I didn't enjoy it. It was horrible, because it had to be done, but it was horrible. But what I could do even then, even when I was doing that, was make sure that it was done in a context of being tough on the issues, but being really kind and compassionate with people. So I think it's possible to have both running in constant. I think sometimes, and at the moment, I would say in healthcare, I really feel we've got to go through quite a serious and significant program of change in the NHS, because I think unless we do, I don't think the NHS will be there for future generations. And so sometimes those forces of change are so real and so big that you've got to face that reality. But giving people a sense of stability in the way that change is managed, I think is really, really important. And I talked about fight or flight. We've all worked in organisations where we felt fearful,
Hmm.
and that is not a good context to be leading change, because people really, I mean, the science tells us they literally can freeze,
Hmm.
or they go, and
Yeah.
both of which are really bad scenarios. So trying to create innovation where we all know that you've been in those meetings where you've been really worried about asking what you think might be a daft question. It's often the question that most needs asking.
Yeah.
So, but trying to get people in a state where they feel that every meeting they go into, you know what, it's okay to ask that question. But so setting that kind of culture is
Mm.
is really, really key.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I liked as well how you touched on the humanity aspect of it, that I think when you're not in leadership and you see these changes happen, you forget that behind the leadership and the job title is a person who doesn't necessarily like what they have to do, but you have a job and you have to do it in order to help the organization continue and potentially thrive. And then on the other side of it, as well as a leader, ensuring that you encompass humanity in what you're doing, and making sure that you take your team with you. I liked how you touched on that. Nicholas asks, how can you foster the emergence of cooperation in an environment that might be hostile towards the idea of cooperation, or promotes incentives opposite to its emergence?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. And this is really tricky. We'll have all been trying to lead change in those sorts of circumstances. I know I have. And I think there's a number of things you can pull on. I think logic line is often the least effective sometimes. Just it's a bit like, I don't want to get into politics of what's just happening in the USA around the election at the moment, but logic line might tell you that the outcome could have been very different. It just wasn't. So, those human factors about how people respond to change, the kind of things I use when the environment's hostile is a couple of things. I will really try and appeal to that emotional hook about what is it we're trying to change and why. I will try and get my narrative very well written around playing to people. If you tell a story about, I used to spend a lot of time looking at, for example, things that have gone wrong in hospitals. If you think about, I'm sure you've all had families and friends where the care hasn't worked for whatever reason. Staff, in my experience, learn most and are more responsive to change when you start to talk about the impact that's had on the patient or the family, because what we all do as human beings is relate to that. And as suddenly start building what I call that relational fabric, which is you really hook people into, there's a reason why we must change this. So I think some of it, that's a useful tool to use, Nicholas. But also, I would also really try and play to some of the things that we talked about in system 2, where are the champions of change? And I think it's quite often really useful to go where the energy is. I know that's an overused term,
Mm-hmm.
but often what can start to happen is people start to see the benefits of getting involved in that change, and the change itself, it does build momentum. But sometimes, you know what? Sometimes you've actually just got to deal head on with the hostility. And there have been times when it's just been totally unacceptable, particularly
Mm-hmm.
you can imagine in healthcare, there have been times when a hostility or a hostile resistance to change has been absolutely not the thing that we should be doing if we're all here for patients. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes to call that out and just say, actually, you're either on the bus and the bus is moving, or I'm afraid that we need to have a conversation about you getting off the bus. And I have had those conversations in a number of scenarios. So I think it's horses for courses, but I think
Yeah.
hopefully there are a few things that might be helpful.
I think that leads on to the next question. Actually, I'm not doing it I'm picking the questions out that come to give everyone a chance. But I think that leads on nicely to what should your leadership look like when you're surrounded by other leaders. So not just your team and your staff, it's other leaders who become cynical or are coasting along in survival mode, or have become numb to the negative impact of cyclical policy and guidance changes.
Yeah. Boy, oh boy, and I'm sure we've all been in those scenarios. That is really difficult, and it's really, really difficult to continue with energy around, and because you feel like you're standing out, don't you? You've begun to feel minoritized in those scenarios. And, we were just touching there about how important it is not to go with that crowd, to continue to find ways. And it's really hard, so where do you find your support group as a leader? It's not always in the ways that you immediately think. I found it often on, I'm not talking about X here. I'm not a fan of X as it's panning out here, but social media networks like LinkedIn, you can often find other networks which will just give you the strength and the oxygen you need to kind of keep going one more day. I do think finding people that can amplify that message when you stood in a room full of people who are probably feeling very, very cynical. So looking at where the energy is and where the positive energy is, and I have been in scenarios where I haven't found that for some considerable time, and wondered whether I ever would. I always did in the end. But it's whether you can keep going long enough to find it. And slowly, I think also creating a space where some of those people who are displaying the cynicism can actually have a bit of a safe space to talk about why they're doing that or why they're feeling the pressure to do that. And that's often important, just to give people an out. Quite often people know that they're part of the problem, not part of the solution. And they want out of that. But so finding ways to just help them do that without looking like they're walking away from their tribe.
Brilliant. I think we've got time for two more questions. So I'm going to combine a couple of the questions. So one of the questions that's come in is around encouraging people to be more innovative and prioritize long-term impacts more than short-term impacts. But how would you do that in terms of ensuring those on the shop floor as well have a voice, so that you're not just, I suppose, leading change from the top? What's your advice around bringing people with you to be more innovative?
This is a really, really important point, I think, because people want to see a longer term vision. That longer term vision, and it may feel like it's way out of reach at the moment, but it's really important. And some people think better strategically than they do tactically. So, I think you should really play on those two pivot points. The way I think to get people, the best way I found to get people involved is, I think it's quite important to talk about those 2 points, tactical and strategic tram lines and work through the formal hierarchy. I think there's a place for that. You'll often find leaders can juggle that sort of time in their diary, particularly if you support them as their leader. They can find ways to do it, work on the short term and longer term projects as well. But I think the drive, the extra momentum you get through bringing groups, just asking for volunteers to come together about areas that they feel most passionate about. And one of the things I learned was, in my last job, I had a series of what we call big and small conversations. And all I did, and all the team I worked with did, was go into a room, virtual or otherwise, big or small, and ask the question, what matters to you today? And I think that's a really, really good way of getting more people. It's a really accessible way of people just beginning a conversation. And it was really, really insightful for me. And what that did was led to a whole program of things short-term things that I needed to fix as a leader or help to work around, and longer-term things that I then began to realize people were really interested in. So they weren't always my ideas, and nor should they be. So it's that balance of short and long term, and things that obviously do come from the organisation, but an equal amount of things that are coming from the field as well.
Great. And I think that this leads on from that. So George has asked, what is your experience of using short-term timeframes, deadlines to drive urgency and focus minds on change rather than long-term planning and multiple meetings, which can lead to procrastination? Are there any tools, any resources that you would recommend using to keep that momentum going so that people, as you said, can accomplish those tasks in the short term, but keep that mind on the long term?
Yeah, I think this is really probably very, very much in system 2 kind of working. Just what do you want to do? How do we support you as a team? And whatever you're thinking about, whether it's to I'm going to give some examples, but some of those things like building a lighthouse hospital in 5 weeks, And let me tell you, that was not easy. I just put a team together who really wanted to work on it. They knew it was going to be the experience of their career. And I said, I'm going to give you everything I can. I'm going to give you all the support I can, but you manage it and you manage it in the way, and you'll get my backing. Let's see if we can make it happen. And guess what we did? So there's something about really giving those people all the support they need, checking in with them for sure, but letting them drive it. And then talking about the progress they're making really, really frequently. Look, it's coming out of the ground. Look, oh, it's opening. It's actually going to be there. So what can you do to amplify there? Because sometimes short deadlines, I'm a big fan of, shall we just get this done?
Yeah.
So it's a bit about the language, but that's a beautiful environment for system 2. Not everything works well there. And some people get really nervous about, does this mean we're bypassing the hierarchical structures, all the program and project management? No, not necessarily. But you can create impetus, and you can put checkpoints in there to say, I want you to check in with me to just make sure we've got all of those governance and the normal program management things taken care of. You don't have to stifle it in that way.
So you're really empowering your team, aren't you?
Yeah.
You're giving them the power to accomplish those goals,
Yeah.
and just giving them the support that they
Tools.
need. Yeah, yeah. And I think that ownership element that we forget, it's not just handing down the task, it's allowing them, once you allow your team to own that change and really make it their own, there's a higher chance of success. Because they're invested in it, aren't they? They're invested
And
in
then
a
learning
successful outcome.
lots.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you're getting
And
that
it doesn't
development
always work.
opportunity.
I mean, allow people
Yeah.
to fail as well. I acknowledge that. It doesn't always work.
No, no. But then if you're there to help them look at what we can do better next time, and I think that reflective piece is really important, as well as is helping staff to realize that, it's not always going to work, but it's okay. What did we learn from that? How can we move things forward and make sure it doesn't happen again? So, no, fantastic. Thank you so much. I felt like a lot of those were quite deep questions. So I really appreciate you taking the time today to show your presentation and answer those questions for us. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
And thank you everybody for attending. It has been recorded. What I will do at the end of the month is we send out a monthly newsletter to all of our partners, and I'll make sure that the link to the recording is in there as well. So you can share with your networks and any, colleagues that you want to share the event with, or think that they could use some insight around the change and leadership. I think that would be really, really useful. But thank you for your time today, everyone. Thank you, Dame Jackie Daniel. That was an amazing first kickoff to our relaunched Inspire Global Networks, and we hope to see you again soon.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.